Hi everyone. I've got bad news. The Earth has already been lost. 2 years ago, the Faza arrived in their motherships and devastated our world. But even after such titanic losses, the human spirit burns bright, and along with rebellion within the invaders' ranks, we're making a last-ditch effort to fight off the invaders, destroy their motherships, and reclaim our world in Faza. Faza is a fully cooperative game where each player will control a specialist fighting against the alien invaders. Each specialist has a slightly different ability set and actions, but broadly speaking, the players will spend their turns moving around the randomly distributed board tiles, gathering up alien troops, fighting off groups of attacking Faza, and eventually taking the fight to the alien motherships themselves. In light of the fully cooperative nature of the game, the players can take turns in any order they want, working together to make the best use of their limited resources, and that's actually really cool. Each player has a number of action cards, which they will exhaust when they take actions, and cleverly, these cards also reflect your character's health, with each injury disabling a card and its associated action. Player actions are generally about moving around the board, fighting Faza, recruiting rebels, and using unique character skills. After all players have spent their actions, the team phase is over, and the Faza phase happens. In this phase, the Faza will attack rebels and players, summon reinforcements, and the motherships will activate. The three motherships all behave differently, following the programmed instructions on their tile in order to move around the board and cause devastating effects, depending on which ship is activated. The carrier swarms tiles with Faza warriors, the destroyer absolutely wrecks players and their rebel allies, and the former flips tiles over, Faza forming the landscape. In the grand tradition of cooperative games, there's only one victory condition here, the destruction of all three motherships. But there are plenty of ways to lose. If any of the player's characters dies, if the board becomes too crowded with Faza warriors, or if all the outposts have been Faza formed, the game is over for you and your insignificant rebellion. Now, what I like most about Faza is the theme itself. It has a neat aesthetic that calls to mind pulp comic book sci-fi adventures that I think is really, really cool. And I also like how each of the characters functions differently enough that your team composition will definitely factor into your strategy. Another aspect of the game that I think is really cool is how the motherships themselves work. Each one follows a different programmatic behavior, and since you know which mothership is going to activate next, at least most of the time, you'll be able to anticipate how best to deal with its devastating effects on the board. And you'll have to, because Faza does not pull any punches. Winning is never guaranteed, and often feels, and sometimes is, downright impossible. And that's really where my criticism of the game comes in, because I'm a fan of cooperative games, and I definitely have a taste for the tougher ones, and Faza definitely fits into that category. But unfortunately, the way it generates its challenge isn't through clever enemy strategies or complex goals for players to achieve. Faza has something of an over-reliance on luck-based mechanics. From the get-go, the board setup is randomized, and that randomness doesn't really translate into interesting gameplay. Sometimes you'll be overwhelmed with enemies from the very first turn, and other times you might be spread far apart from the spaces where you want to take actions, and will spend your early turns doing nothing more than moving across the board, and, depending on which character you are, that movement can be pretty slow. Combat is randomized too, relying on dice rolls, and while there is a bit of dice mitigation, again, depending on which character you are, the fact is that some bad rolls will leave you just absolutely floundering. As I just said, the mothership's movements are at least mostly predictable, so they add a good kind of tension. But whenever you're attacking one of the motherships, which is the only way to win, you will trigger an event card, and these cards are where things can get really frustrating. Some events are beneficial to the players, which is nice, but most aren't, and you can easily find yourself going from a strong, or at least stronger, board position to helpless at the whim of a card. And since these cards are drawn after you've committed to attacking the motherships, there's no real way to plan around them, and they have the potential to derail any of the delicate success you might have been enjoying up until that point. And for me, that's where Faza is weakest. By having so many elements of the game center on randomness and luck, it takes away the sense of planning and agency that is otherwise the good part of a tough cooperative game. Your efforts to work together can and will be stymied by dice and cards, and when that happens, you might be left feeling like you're mopping the deck on the Titanic, undone not by tactics or strategy, but by dumb bad luck. Cooperative games often follow a familiar rhythm. Players fight fires, and the game starts more of them. Two examples of that are Pandemic and Flashpoint, both games where players often can't predict where the next disaster will strike. But what is successful in those games that Faza fails to achieve is that in a game like Pandemic, the effectiveness of your character's actions are static, known things. You can remove a cube from the space you're in. That's what that action does. In Faza, since you're often taking an action and then having to roll the dice or flip a card to see how it goes, you've got randomness leading to randomness, and in between, that sense of agency that players would otherwise use as leverage against a game's capriciousness is nullified. So, at the end of the day, where does that leave Faza in my estimation? Well, to say that it's a game I wanted to love would be fair. I think this has tremendous potential here, and designer Ben Farahmand has the makings of a great game buried underneath all of this randomness. In particular, the way the motherships operate is fantastic, and I think that that sort of design could form the spine of any number of tense, engaging cooperative games. Now, it's worth noting that the designer has recognized the randomness in the game, and that particularly of the event cards, as being a sticking point for some folks, and he's developed some simple house rules for limiting their effect. And there's definitely fun to be had here. When you manage to beat Faza, which we have, on the easiest difficulty setting, of course, it's satisfying and fun, and always nail-biting, and that might be your jam. That said, I do have difficulty recommending Faza as it is now, only because I do think it'll frustrate more people than it will delight. But I also think that if you know what you're getting into from the get-go, then the right group could have a really, really great time throwing themselves up against this alien menace, and hopefully coming out on top. Or at least enjoying the experience as they get their butts kicked in. Hey, Meeple and I thank you for watching. If you want to see more of our reviews, please click on either of these playlists. One of them is our full-length review series, and the other one is Game in a Minute, where we tell you everything you need to know about a game in about 60 seconds. If you'd like to subscribe, please click the G and ring the bell so that you get a notification every time we publish. And if you like what we do and want to support us, please check out links to our Patreon below. We'll see you next game. Flesh and blood.